Good morning and welcome to our 2021 Kirkland DEI Leadership Summit Part 2. So we are very excited for our guest speaker today. This is a three-part series. So hopefully you were able to join us last month for our in-person event at the Woodmark Hotel. Where we had a wonderful panel of guests speaking on a variety of topics around diversity and inclusion. This month, we are very excited to welcome Robert Britten, who I will introduce in just a moment. But first, I need to acknowledge our amazing sponsors who helped to make this possible today. So the Kirkland Chamber could not do this without your support. And this event actually functions under our 501c3 Kirkland Chamber Foundation. So thank you to today's sponsors, which are Google, Alaska Airlines, Port of Seattle, and Puget Sound Energy. Thank you so much for your support. We could not have done this program without you. So because this is a virtual event, we are going to move right into it. I will say that we are streaming live on Facebook. And so please be sure to put your questions into the comments section of Facebook so that we can address them at the end. There will be a Q&A section. So feel free to post them anytime, and then I will ask them to our guest speaker. So today we welcome Robert Britten, who is the Executive Director of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion for Lake Washington Institute of Technology. He is a native of Louisiana and an accomplished writer and author, educator, advocate, mentor, and trained facilitator in dependable strengths. He is a past recipient of the Alan Spence Scholarship Award, a graduate of the Social Justice Leadership Institute from Bellevue College, and the Administrators of Color Leadership Program. He is currently serving on the Faculty and Staff of Color Planning Committee to support the efforts of staff and faculty of color in higher education, and has received various certificates and awards throughout his career. He served in the U.S. Armed Forces and has formal work experience as a human resources manager and a corporate recruiter, in addition to being an accomplished speaker, trainer, and workshop designer and presenter. Robert is a board member for Lighthouse Storehouse and counsels combat vets with PTSD. He is an avid reader, loves to travel, laugh, and serve others. He is often seen designing workshops, delivering keynotes like the one today, and telling his stories of triumph over adversity and encouraging others to find personal strength through their gifts. He is also a published author, publishing 2 books, No Time Like the Present and When Leadership Matters. So please welcome Robert Britten. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Samantha, for that wonderful introduction, and also to the Chamber sponsors. It is wonderful for us here at Lake Washington Tech to be a collaborative partner with the Kirkland Chamber. My name is Robert Britten. I am the Executive Director for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at Lake Washington Institute of Technology. And I greet you on behalf of our president, Dr. Amy Morrison, who unfortunately cannot be here with us today, but she does send her greetings and her support for these efforts, not only the efforts of the chamber, but the efforts of the institution around equity work. And also Elizabeth Sorensen, the director of our foundation, who introduced me to the chamber, and also our executive cabinet and our trustees. And I introduce myself along with all of my esteemed colleagues and supporters, because one thing that we know about equity is that we don't go any place on our own and by ourselves. And so I come to you with the combined knowledge of all those who support the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion at Lake Washington Tech. And so one of the topics of today's discussion is around EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion, and its impacts on education. And I want to begin this session by giving a land acknowledgement, which is an offshoot of some of the work we do for equity. We acknowledge that the Lake Washington Tech campus is on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, past and present, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Coast Salish, Stillaguamish, Snoqualmie, Muckleshoot, and Duwamish tribes. We acknowledge these tribes by showing respect and take an intentional step towards correcting the stories and practices that erase Indigenous peoples' history and culture, and towards inviting and honoring truth. And so that land acknowledgement is an impact of EDI on education, to acknowledge the ways by which we share space with one another and the ways by which we combine efforts to holistically lift up an entire community and not just ourselves. And so some institutions have gone as far as to include a labor acknowledgement alongside of their land acknowledgement. Again, when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's about all the ways by which we holistically engage in conversations, engage in actions, and engage in policy development around the communities that we serve, whether that's from an educational standpoint or even from a business standpoint. Policies and practices govern all that we do. And we also began this process by having a shared understanding of what we mean by equity, diversity, and inclusion. And mind you, some places, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector, would use the interchangeable terms of EDI and DEI. And it's basically the premise of equity, diversity, and inclusion versus diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is really about what you choose as an institution or an organization to lead with. At Lake Washington Tech, we're leading with equity. And equity is really fair treatment and access to opportunity and achievement for all people. It does not mean the same thing as equality, which is giving everybody the same thing. And so we are intentional about how we approach the EDI aspect of the work that we're doing to really engage in our community in a holistic way. Diversity is all the ways by which people differ and all the ways people show up in terms of their lived and learned experiences. And what we found at Lake Washington Tech, and this has been part of the fabric of our institution, is that equity informs what we do educationally. And it also informs how we invite other people into a shared space, which is also a component, is the inclusionary component, which is a variety of people having power, having a voice in decision-making, and also having authority to make those decisions. And so when we began to look at it from a holistic and systematic standpoint, one of the things that we mandated by our SBCTC, and it is the State Board of Technical and Community Colleges, to really dismantle systemic racism at the college level. And what does that mean for us in our educational journey is that we began to recognize that there are some gaps in terms of how we look at how we give access to and how we support students of color. And so, and mind you that equity work is not just about race. Equity work is not just about color. Equity work is about community and how we build community to bring everyone along, but also at the same time, recognizing that not everyone is at the same point or nor at the same level of understanding of why equity, diversity, and inclusion is necessary. And so institutionally, when we start to look at impacts, the impact primarily, it starts with your policies. We have to analyze our policies and look at them from the standpoint of who are they impacting the most in an adverse way. We're not just looking at what works, but we're looking at what's not working, and then ask the fundamental question, why isn't it working? And why aren't we as diverse as the community that we serve? What things are we doing? What things have we done that really limit us or that propels us forward? And when we began to really put our, what we say, the old adage, put your money where your mouth is, those things began to make sense to us in terms of how we holistically look at equity, diversity, and inclusion to ensure that there is equal access for everyone at their level of support or where they need to be met at. Part of the mission or the mission for Lake Washington Institute of Technology is to prepare students for today's careers and tomorrow's opportunities. And what does that mean for us from an equity perspective? It means that we're going to look at the student body that we have, and we're going to do everything that we can to ensure that they are prepared to enter into society, enter into the workforce, enter into their communities, and be contributing partners at a high level. And that means that we have to be intentional about the diversity of our student body and be willing to meet them at their point of need. And so in part, that is providing wraparound services for students from an EDI perspective. Again, recognizing that not every student is going to have the same framework or the same lived experiences. Therefore, we build in a component that gives students an opportunity to really grow into the best version of themselves. And once the student grows, the institution grows along with them. And so it is not a one size fit all kinds of proposition, but it is one of those things that state that I see a need. I see this community having a need, and how can we address it in a manner that helps and does not do harm? And mind you, equity, diversity, and inclusion is not new from a standpoint of having conversations, but it is new somewhat in terms of systemically going about the work of dismantling it from a humanistic perspective. As an example, our system of colleges here in Washington State at the community college level, we have 34 technical and community colleges around the state. And each of us work within this system that says you need to do X, Y, and or Z. And so we have different mandates that we must meet or different criteria that is set up by our state board to say from an equity perspective, we need to have equity surveys done on your climate surveys from an equity perspective, which we've done and began the process of aggregating that data to really look at what things do our students, our staff, and our faculty and our administrators, what do we really need? And how do we give voice to those needs that are spoken to us? And so that work really embodies how we go about systematically addressing the issues that are raised in the ways by which we hire, by the ways by which we recruit. Therefore, we have to look at our applications, but the ways by which we address things internally, which means we have to look at our processes to see who's mostly impacted by the decisions that we make as an institution. And so EDI, it has far-reaching implications for us as an institution, but it also lays the framework and the groundwork for who we are and what we stand for as a community partner. And we know that partnership is is one of the cornerstones of collaboration. And if you have the right partnerships and if you have the right ability to have conversations that are open and that are honest, you begin to get to the root cause of things that limit your ability to exponentially expand and grow. And so what we're finding is that the same things that mainstream industry needs in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion are the things that we also need as educational partners with you. And so we are doing this ground level and groundbreaking work to support business owners and leaders in the community and to support the chamber, because we're able to utilize and leverage the relationships that we have with one another so that we all grow together and not just as a single entity moving forward, but we're multiple entities moving as one, recognizing that there is a need, and collectively we come together to meet that need. And so overall, EDI improves education, and it tells us who's included, but most importantly, it tells us who's not included. And then it becomes a fundamental responsibility that we have as educators to ask the fundamental question, why? We have to be childlike in our approach to equity work. We must always ask why and never be fully satisfied with the status quo. We cannot just do this work to check off a box. We can't do it just to get our bottom line met. We can't do it just to say that we're doing something from an equity perspective to put a face on equity. We have to be really willing to hit the ground running and then stand behind because we're going to make some missteps along the way. We're not going to get this perfect. I'm going to make mistakes. The institution is going to make mistakes, and we know that up front. But the fundamental questions around the mistakes that we make or the faux pas that we enter into is that how much grace are we willing to extend one another in order to get to a place of understanding, a place of holistic awareness, and a place of collaboration so that Even though I may have said something that offended you, how can I mend that bridge so that we can continue to move forward together? Because one of the things that we don't want students to do, and we don't want our community partners to do, we don't want you to suffer in silence. That's why the equity work that we're doing from an EDI perspective in education impacts what you do in the public sector or in the private sector. However you're coming to the work of equity, it requires all of our collective voices. And that really improves our instructional practices. And here's a very practical example of how it has improved our instructional practices. This year, we've implemented a social justice component to our degree and certificate programs. And it is led up by one of our VPs and also one of our faculty members to really frame out what does that equity component look like so that all of our students are meeting the mission to be prepared to enter into the workforce. And so that equity component is a social justice and diversity component that really speaks to the heart of what does it take to teach diversity in a class? How do we manage conversations in a class? What is the curriculum? What are some of these basic components that a student may need if they haven't been exposed to a diverse community? How can we prepare them by introducing them to diversity in the classroom so that they have a space to have conversations, and those conversations are led by individuals who are being prepared to teach in those sectors of our classrooms so that, again, students are prepared to meet the challenge of a diverse work environment. And one of the things that we know is that almost every organization, whether it's in education or whether it's in public and or private sector, everyone is talking about the buzz that is equity, that is diversity, that is inclusion. So how can we as an institution become more inclusive in the ways by which we address the systemic issues that cause barriers of access for individual communities that are marginalized? And so we began to take the intentional steps at Lake Washington Tech to really look at who we are as an institution. It goes beyond having good intentions. We also have to look at the impact of what our policies, our practices, our processes, and our procedures have had on marginalized communities. And I'm proud to say that at Lake Washington Tech in education, those are some of the conversations we're having, and those are the things we are addressing so that we can be more reflective of the communities that we serve. And we recognize that the work that we're doing is not easy. We recognize that every individual is going to have a different perspective and a viewpoint. There may be things that we agree on, and there may be things that we disagree on. But the equity component of that is that how can we have the conversation around what it looks like so we can bring everyone along? You know, one of the things I remember about Dr. King when I apply this to an equity framework, and when the comment was made to him, well, why don't Black people just pick themselves up by their bootstraps? And he made a statement, and I'm going to paraphrase this. Well, maybe you're not considering that many of us don't have boots. And so when we start to look at from an equity perspective, what do you have? What are you showing up with? And what are your lived experiences that causes you to approach us in this manner? And so we have to understand that, again, that there are differences. And if we are going to provide access, we also have to provide opportunity. And if we are providing opportunity, we also have to provide pathways. And so what we do in education from that equity perspective is a thing called guided pathways, where we began to look at what are the ways by which we are doing what we are doing to impact our communities, but also how can we serve and support them while we are giving them the resources to learn and to grow into, again, a better version of themselves. And so we do this by talking to the individual. We talk to the communities, and we go beyond outreach and go to engagement. And this model causes us to be strategic partners within our community so that the community knows that if their student or if a student from their community attends the Lake Washington Institute of Technology, that they can begin to see others who look like them, who represent them, who has their best interests at heart and the best interests of their community at heart. because when one of us grow, all of us grow. You know, in the military, we had no man left behind. And so if no one is left behind, how do we begin to see others as we see ourselves? And that is, again, one of those fundamental pieces that we look at. But EDI is the opportunity to get it right. And we have ways by which we can do that. There are strategies to employ. There are equity lenses to apply to the policies, the practices, and the procedures that you have in place that really ascertain the root causes of some of the ways by which we are engaging with or not engaging with the communities that we serve. And we have to be willing to acknowledge where we're falling short, because not all of what we do is a bed of roses. But what we find is that while we're doing equity work, we're learning. While we're doing equity work, we're growing. While we are doing equity work, we are progressing. And so we have to learn not to be beat up on ourselves, but be willing to critically analyze and look at ourselves in a way that acknowledges where we fall short, because then we become better. Then we become more agile. Then we become more resilient how we support one another in this work. And so we do this with the focus of it, with the establishment of EDI as a component that is part of who we are. And that component says that, you know, I recognize, Robert, that you didn't have the same upbringing that I did, but I see the value that you're bringing to the conversation. I recognize that you don't necessarily have all of the components of X, Y, and Z, but I see the potential of you being in a boardroom. I see the opportunity for you to be an aeronautical engineer. I see the opportunity for me to speak a life into you. And when we're able to do that in a way that really supports the person that is in front of us, or the multitude of people that are in front of us, we began to really be intentional about how we engage with one another. And you see, there is a great deal of resources from the state level and in other places that are being directed towards equity, because the society sees that there is an imbalance. And society is demanding that we respond to that imbalance in a way that brings wholeness to our communities and support the diversity that makes us who we are. And so to do this, EDI not only makes us stronger, it makes us more resilient. And that resilience says, no matter what shows up, I'm going to address it. I'm going to show up because you're showing up. I'm going to be here to give you the resources and the access that you need. And that requires us to really look at systems. It's not just about individuals. This is about systems. Systems are in place to give us the result that we have. And so when I say that, whatever result that we're consistently getting from a certain thing, that's because the systems that we have in place are designed to give us that result. And it doesn't mean that we have to go and just throw a hammer at all of the systems that are in place, but it does mean that incrementally, if we make incremental adjustments in the system, we don't have to rebuild the whole system. We can make little tweaks here, a little change there, and then change as necessary as we evolve into, again, the better version of ourselves. We look at our processes, and not when the system is in place, when this happens, that is a response to that. And so there's a process by which we go through, and that process now either has to be tweaked or left alone. But we understand that we have to be responsive and not reactionary. Because once we find ourselves being reactionary to a situation, that's when we get into trouble. That's when we make mistakes. That's when we fall off the rails and we become frustrated with the system because it's not giving us what we need. And so when we began to incrementally respond to things versus reacting to them, we get better results. Each of them will give you an outcome, but which one would you prefer? Would you prefer to get a result that's going to cause you to grow, or a result that's going to cause you to go off the rail and it's going to cost you more money in the long run? And so we began to, again, establish EDI priorities that are embedded in the framework of who we are. You see, at Lake Washington Tech, education is the primary goal for our students, to give them educational frameworks and conversations to have, or give them vocabulary to speak their truth. And while their truths may not be the same, if your truth comes from a place of knowing and a place of understanding, then you can bring others along with you. Because you don't go any place. As I gave the introduction, I brought in my president, our executive cabinet, our foundation director, and all of you. There is an African term or Swahili term around that's called sawubona. Many of you may have heard it, but sawubona means we see you, and it's a greeting. And the response to sawubona is yabos sawubona. And I learned about sawubona from one of our faculty members here at Lake Washington Tech, who invited me to speak about equity to his class. And sawubona was the framework for the class that was taught that evening. And I appreciated it so much that it shifted how I entered into a space. Because from an equity perspective, again, we don't enter into a space by ourselves. We come with our lived experiences. We come with the learned experiences of the teachings of our ancestors. All of those things are coming along with us. And so when we enter into a space, you not only get Robert Britten, but you get Robert Britten and everything that he brings with him. And so we're able to engage with one another in ways that matter. And so when we have equity conversations in education, it's about how can we become better at what we do? How can we become better, not only as an institution, but how can we become better as individuals? And how can we frame difficult conversations in a way that we can basically meet the need of the individual that is in front of us? There is so much that we can do. And when we do it in a manner that elevates us as a society and as a community, we all grow and become better for it. Now, this is what I want to leave you with: an opportunity to truly examine who you are, why you are, and for what purpose. Who are you willing to support and or help? Are you willing to support someone that looks like you or someone that doesn't? What that looks like in an educational setting. I designed a workshop several years ago to a group of educators, and we were talking about compensation in education. And I asked the fundamental question: how many of you have given away $1 million? And folks in the room looked at me like I was half crazy. But then I reframed it. I said, well, how many of you have offered a job to someone that paid a minimum of $50,000 a year? And maybe it was many years ago, what have you, but you offered them that job and they're still working that today. And then several arms went up. And so people were able to acknowledge the fact that they had given a person a job for $50,000 a year. And so I began to tell them, to ask them the question, now, who did that person look like? Did that person look like you, or did that person look like me? Because what you've essentially done is given away $1 million. Because over the course of a career, that $50,000 would turn into $1 million plus over the course of a career. And so who are we transferring wealth to? That's an equity perspective. That's an equity conversation. And so when we began to elevate our thinking in terms of how we do the things that we do naturally, and sometimes we're doing things naturally and unintentionally harming someone else. So we have to not only own our intent, but we have to also own our impact. And so sometimes the practices, the policies, and the behaviors of the institutions that we are a part of, their intentions may be well, but the impact of what policies and their practices harm and marginalize communities that are already marginalized. And so how can we mend the hurt? How can we heal them? And how can we bring equity and parity to the situation? There is no quick fix to this. Most institutions have some component of brokenness. And so you don't have to, again, change everything about who you are and what you're doing. But when we began to make incremental shifts in our thinking, and we're able to move in a way that acknowledges the value of the individuals that are in the room, you don't have to create a new table. Just invite someone else to a new seat, and we can change the dynamics of who we are and how we function and how we support and see one another as human beings. And the educational landscape really shifted and changed a couple of years ago when George Floyd was killed and the Black Lives Matter movement happened. And I'll give you this and leave you this with as an example. And I shared this with a couple of our institutions some months ago. But it's about how do we look at this from an equity perspective, and how do we look at this from a manner that makes sense for all of us? And the example that was given, and many of you may have heard this example, but if you're in a community and one of the houses in the community is on fire, and the fire department is coming in with their various trucks and vehicles, and they are dousing out the fires, they don't come into that neighborhood and say, all houses matter. They come in and address the one that is in critical need. And so when we talk about equity perspectives in this regard, talking about those who are in critical need right now, let's address that issue, because when you are made whole, we are made whole. When you are safe, we are safe. And so we're coming at it from a paradigm of how do we begin to recognize what's needed. And I'll say this as a parting thought. You do not lose anything by being equitable. You do not lose anything by being diverse. You do not lose anything by being inclusive. If you employ equitable practices, equal access and opportunity, and you are inclusive in the ways by which you see one another, you will win and you will come out on the other side more whole and more resilient, more ready and able to address the issues of the day. Thank you very much. And I will allow Samantha to come in with questions that may be available.
All right. Thank you so much for your presentation today. We were so impressed by how you ended the program last month with your comment that we just knew that you would be a good speaker again today. So we do have a couple of questions. The first one is, how would you say that educators can begin to guide safe conversations within the classroom?
Thank you for that question. And in part, educators have to be comfortable with themselves and comfortable with what they don't know. Because we recognize that, again, not everyone is at the same stage. But when we are uncomfortable about entering into conversations about things, and someone is in front of us pressing the issue, it's okay to say, even if you're an educator, say, I don't know. But I do have a resource. I can bring in someone. I can bring in an expert, because that's an area that I still need to grow in myself. And so the level of transparency is important in that regard, because it builds trust, but it also lets the other individual know that I'm an educator, but I'm also being educated. And so when we began to look at the framework of what it means to be in front of someone, it's give and take. It's not just me giving you information, it's about you giving me information as well, so that collectively we grow together.
Thank you. Next, what are some of the biggest things that parents can do to support kids as they enter school? So maybe on the younger end, and begin to have some of these conversations early on and actually throughout their career as a student.
Great, another great question. Kids are so resilient and they're very inquisitive. And so I think that if we are prepared for the questions, because children will ask those tough questions of us, and if we're not prepared to answer them, it kind of sets us back. And so honesty is always the best policy, but begin to frame it at a level that they would understand it and give them practical examples. Not only do children need examples, adults need examples. And so when we began to frame equity conversations around things that we've seen, things that how we've personally navigated, and it's okay to say, you know, baby, I don't know, or I'm ready to learn that. What do you know? What do you think about that? And so we can answer the question as parents, but also ask them, well, what do you think? And even ask the question, well, how did you come to that question? What things are going on at school or in your conversations with your friends that bring that up for you? And so how can we address it together? And so let's go to the library. Let's go ask a librarian the best book that you and I can read together and talk about these particular issues, because now you're bringing community to bear in the things that you're doing, and how to support yourselves and your family. And that family dynamic is so critical. And lean on the resources that you have for extended family. Who's in your community? Who's part of your close circle? Who do you trust as a confidant? Because you already know who not to ask. But for those that you do know how to ask, go and ask them, because there is, like we say in the street, there is no shame in my game. Because if it's going to make my child better, then I'm going to get into it, and I'm going to go and get them the resources that they need. Because when they become better, I become better. And it's very reciprocal in that manner. And so just trust your instinct, trust your heart, and don't be afraid to ask tough questions of yourself, because your children will challenge you and they will ask you questions that you're not prepared to answer. But when they do, don't shy away from it, embrace it, and move through the journey with them.
Thank you. Next question touches on something that you talked about in terms of stumbling and how we're not perfect, and how sometimes we trip over ourselves and we make mistakes and we offend others. What are some steps that you think are most important when that happens to do in the immediate, when you've offended someone? What are some of the things that you can do to kind of right the wrong immediately within this lens?
Great. Thank you for that question. And there are a couple of ways by which that happens. On one hand, it can happen in a setting where someone is visibly shaken by what you said, and they show up right then and there in the midst of everybody. And sometimes an individual may be offended, but they connect with you afterwards and bring it to your attention. And so, and I'll give you an example of a situation that I was in. I was talking with a group of educators, and we were talking about LGBTQ issues. And I said something in that session that impacted one of the participants, and they froze on the screen. And they didn't participate that much afterwards, but after the conversation, they said, "Robert, you said something that triggered me, and I want to give you an opportunity to make it right, because I don't think you meant anything by it, but this was the impact to me." And so I apologize for the thing that I said that was incorrect, that impacted them, and told them that as I learn, I will be more mindful of how I use language in the future, so that I'm mindful of who's in the space with me. Because again, intent versus impact. That impacted her, even though I did not have the intention to do so. But she had the courage to come and say, "You know, Robert, this was not correct." And so, and this is how I was able to navigate my own personal growth in that, by having that conversation. Now, on the other hand, if you're in a setting and someone is just kind of coming at you in the real time, and just acknowledge right then and there, "I'm sorry that impacted you in that manner. This was my intent. Now, what can I do? Do you have a suggestion as to how I could have said that differently, so that that impact that you felt would not have been detrimental? How can we do that?" And that requires confidence in the facilitator, the individual up front, so that they're not taken aback that by someone posing a question to them about something that they themselves said. And so we have to understand that there are things that we often say that impact others negatively that we are unaware of. And I'll give you another example of something that I was at a prior institution, and I was having a conversation with one of the executives of the college. And she said, "Robert, I really want to have a conversation with you, man, because you know what you said was on point. And man, what you were saying was something that I needed to grow from. And so let's get on my calendar." I said, "Yeah, no problem. I'll set us up a powwow and we can go and talk and do X, Y, and Z." And so she departed, I departed. But the moment I sat down, I realized that I had said, "Oh, let's have a powwow," not realizing how offensive that is to Native Americans. And so I went back to our office and tracked her down to say, "Hey, I apologize for what I said," because the moment I sat in my office, I recognized what I had said, and I recognized that it was wrong. And I apologize to you for saying that in that manner. And so I would love to be on your calendar. Let's find an appropriate time for us to get together. And so everything is about how you phrase it, how you come across, and how authentic you're willing to be to that individual. And authenticity requires vulnerability. Vulnerability is a fearful thing for so many of us, because for so many of us, we've been taught that being vulnerable is weakness. But let me tell you right now, your vulnerability is your strength. Lean on it, lean into it, and grow with it, because your capacity to understand humanity is in your vulnerability.
Thank you. Could you give maybe a good example of a policy that has been changed within an educational institution that has helped to become more inclusive and equitable? Maybe something that was a long-standing normal thing within multiple institutions, or even a specific one to an institution that maybe you're familiar with?
Thank you for that question. Let me ponder that for 1 minute here, and I'll give you one, because there are oftentimes things that change that we don't realize that are steeped in policy. They may be a practice or a procedure that impacts the way that a policy is administered. And if I can recall correctly, and I'll use my prior institution as an example, a practice of doing what we call appointments. We were told and so what we mean by appointments. And so there are times when an institution will have a need to fill a position. And instead of, because the critical necessity of that role, they'll appoint someone internally to fill that role temporarily until they're able to ascertain someone who's more qualified or ready to step into the role more permanently. And one of the things that were told to me is that as a policy, we no longer do appointments. And mind you, just a week before, I saw someone being appointed to a role that didn't look like me. But when it came to me, I had to apply for it the traditional way, because this is what was said to me. We don't want anyone to think you were given something, and we want you to be able to compete for it and win it on your own merit. And my question was, okay, what about the merit of the other individuals that were appointed? Do they not have the same rigor to go through the same processes as I did? And so it caused the individual to pause, but the practice did not change. And so when we begin to hear about things that impact us, policies and practices are different. And so sometimes the practice is a result of a policy, and sometimes a policy creates practices that are inequitable. It depends on who's administering them. And we find that all the time in the ways by which we are looking at, like for instance, when we're looking at policies or admissions for Lake Washington Tech, we're looking at, okay, what are the demographics of the students that are coming into this program? Why aren't there minority students, or why aren't they more equitable in terms of the dominant culture students who are part of this program? Why is that? When we see that when we have minority students that are part of the program, they score as well as, or if not better than, those white students of comparable educational standing or what have you. And so we see that there's the capacity there, but we'll maybe not be recruiting to those communities. And so when we start to look at the practice of the policy, we also understand that the nuance of administering it differs from person to person. And so therein tells us sometimes we have to provide training, equity-based training to individuals or individual departments so that it is given more equitably in terms of opportunity for marginalized communities.
Thank you. In terms of community support for DEI work within educational systems, what's something that the larger community, maybe that doesn't have children in school right now, what's something that the larger community could do to support this work?
Great question. I think being involved, find ways to be involved. As an example, every school has a become part of the foundation, connect with the foundation directors and find out ways by which the outreach that the foundation is doing, that they can participate in that and bring in more opportunities for access for individuals within the community. And not only that, attend community meetings, Be involved in the school board, whether you have a child or not. Talk to individuals that do have children and find out what levels of resources that they need. Because oftentimes families who have children who are actively engaged or moving through that educational system may not have the access or the resources that you have as a person who's a community member who's concerned. And so how do you bring your concerns forward? Sometimes you can write an op-ed in the local paper. Sometimes you can voice your opinion at the city council meeting. Sometimes you can go to the school. Every school, like for instance, every institution of higher education has open forums with their trustees and their college leadership. And so you can be a community member and attend those meetings and give voice to the things that you see as pertinent to those particular areas. And then put your money where your mouth is. You know, bring your financial resources to these institutions. Help create endowments for marginalized communities or other individuals to support the educational journeys of those who may not have the financial wherewithal to get through their college without having to get a loan. And so again, partner with your foundations and reach out to individuals, find out who's in your network that is doing similar things, and then partner with them to create a stronger network among yourselves.
Okay, last question. If you had to pick one thing that the audience could take away from your talk today, the most important final thing, what would it be?
Lean into your vulnerability and recognize that, again, you're not going to get everything right. You may make the most monumental mistake of your life doing equity work, but stand in the gap and continue to live your best lived experiences on behalf of someone else. There's an old adage that states, one of the greatest honors in a man or woman's life is if their name is mentioned in someone else's testimony. And so look at who you're impacting by the journey that you're on and recognize that someday they may recognize you in the greatest achievement of their lives and honor you.
That is a great final thought. Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation today. Thank you so much to our speaker. Thank you to our sponsors, again, Google, Alaska Airlines, Port of Seattle, Puget Sound Energy. We appreciate you so much for supporting this work. Thank you for Lake Washington Institute of Technology for allowing our speaker to be with us today. We appreciate it very much. And please stay tuned. Part 3 of this series will be coming up soon. We do not have a date set at the moment, but it will be regarding policing in the community. So that will be coming very soon. So please watch our website and calendar and your emails for more info to come. Thank you so much for joining us today. This recording will be available indefinitely, so you can share it with anyone to receive this message. Thank you so much.